How many of you have noticed these tree labels along Prince Street? Okay. That's the subject of the talk today. They're the beginning of our campus arboretum, which John Wilden and I designed last year and fabricated, and then recently Jeff Curtis helped install. You can see the two of them here. John drilling and Jeff standing like a good worker. So this project came about because I teach a plant identification class in the fall, and I was wondering how we might extend the teaching and learning beyond that class. So the Prince Street Arboretum is a first response to that. Now, an arboretum, in case you were wondering, is literally a place for trees. And it's not a new idea, but traditionally it has often been associated with universities and schools and academies. The very word academy comes from this olive grove that Plato taught in, which is kind of an arboretum of sorts. And then the Lyceum also was another garden where Aristotle taught, which presumably had some trees. So the Prince Street Arboretum is my kind of attempt at singling out the street trees in order to create an outdoor classroom for our campus. The design strategy is to take something that's already there, which are the trees on Prince Street, and repurpose them, kind of spin-off of this old idea, which I like to think of as tinkering. So this is something I've done in other contexts. This is a rail fence with locust rails that I put together to separate an orchard on one side and pasture on another in Rhode Island. So the idea is to kind of use ready-made materials and fit things together in a kind of bricolage. So the idea for the Arboretum is not to start from scratch, but to work with the existing conditions that we have there, that we've basically inherited, knowing that it's not going to go on indefinitely. And this project that I'm going to show you today is basically a 2-year installation, which is what we agreed upon to get something done here. But I do have aspirations that it might last 1,000 years. So it's all started up on the Blue Ridge with my classes, which go on a transect from the Blue Ridge down to the Tidewater. And this Arboretum is basically a cross-section to a longer field investigation, which goes down Prince Street out to the Potomac, which you're all familiar with. And the Arboretum doesn't actually go there yet, but it's on its way. Because teaching's the goal, the question here is how to get people looking and talking about trees. And we hope that these labels will do that and perhaps can become more of a larger initiative with planting and then paving too, perhaps. So if you go over to King Street, the street trees there are basically all oak trees. But we have this condition on Prince where there's quite a bit of variety in terms of what you will see there. On our stretch between the two buildings, there are 12 different species among the 30 trees that are there. So this is an opportunity that we've taken to think about the condition that in the 20th century we essentially got obsessed with uniformity in our planting, and that as opposed to variety. And if you look at the work of say Dan Kiley, one of the most famous 20th century landscape architects at the Air Force Academy, you'll see that there's a heavy reliance on a few proud species, like honey locust, which we have out in front of 601. But in the context of Alexandria, I was happy to find more diversity in the population. And so we came up with this scheme of labeling them. And there were a lot of questions about how to label them. Should they be on the ground, fixed, hanging? What material should we use? What orientation should they be? And rather than have a competition for this, which probably would have been the wise thing to do, we tried to move along. My tenure clock's ticking, so I had to get something done. But we engaged the people that we had to, the neighbors and the Arts Commission, and they're viewing this as a temporary artwork, which is a purpose that we embrace. And we put up some public notices to make sure the neighbors knew what was happening and get the word out. What we eventually settled on was to use the wood of white oak trees, which are the trees that used to inhabit this area but don't fare so well with urbanization. And then we got some stainless steel threaded rod from Home Depot via China. And John developed a method for laser cutting the Latin and common names into this oak, and we used a Caslon typeface, which is essentially what Linnaeus' first taxonomy was printed in the 18th century. And in order to bring this beyond simply the naming of trees, we also introduced a glossary of terms related to planting design. And essentially what I've noticed is that our vocabulary for tree planting has shrunk in the 20th century, at least in US cities. So words like bosque and copse aren't found in our everyday plantings. Now, this glossary is intended to help us address the question of how and why we plant trees in cities, beyond what's very beautiful here at the Capitol building, the umbrageous quality of trees. That's the word that Olmsted liked to use for shady. I've found is that in our century now, there's been an increased focus on what we call ecosystem services. So the terms like ecosystem and greenway and urban forest have come to dominate our design language. But what I'm thinking is, what about words like pleach and pollard, cluster, clump, spinney, thicket, and of course, how can we live without shrubbery? So in order to extend that, we put these words on the street for all of your consideration. There are some firms that are working with shaping trees. For instance, this is the Comcast Center, which the Olin studio did recently in Philadelphia, where they have pleached the trees, shaped them, and kind of add a bit of grooming to tree plantings. Pleaching is something that Dan Kiley was quite fond of, and but didn't make it into his Pennsylvania Avenue planting that he'd hoped for. And the lindens that he decided to put there were substituted with the willow oak, which does really, really well. So it's hard to complain about that selection. But historically, pleach trees have not just been for something to look at. The material that's cut from them can actually be fodder for animals. And I'm thinking that in our urban context, as urban farms become more prevalent, that there might be ways to bring material from such efforts into a loop with animals. Which is not, there are precedents for this. Woodrow Wilson, for instance, during the First World War, had a flock of sheep be brought in to graze the lawns there around the White House. So I think that there are ways that we can think about extending the possibilities for plantings, especially in cities. And incidentally, in this case, the White House has, in a way, been an arboretum. Many of the trees there were planted by presidents and first ladies, but with tightened security, you can't enjoy this in the same way that I think you will be able to on our Sidewalk Arboretum. And you won't be caught on camera in our Arboretum, as far as I know. So at your own pace, I invite you to stroll along Prince Street and learn some of the names, but also to think about the possibilities for rediscovering some of the rich landscape traditions of caring for trees and shrubs and making appropriate use of them in our time, which may begin simply with tinkering with some of the trees around us. Thank you.